There's a small beetle in the corn fields of central Illinois. Most men never noticed it until it was already too late. It's about the size of a grain of rice. Yellow-green, 3 black stripes. Easy to miss if you're not looking for it. That's the problem. The ones you don't notice are the ones that cost you the most. This one didn't eat the leaves. It didn't go after the ears. It went straight for the roots. And when the roots go, the whole plant goes with it. No wind needed, just gravity and time. By the time a man saw the damage, the field already looked like it had been hit by a storm that never came. Rows leaning, stalks at angles, ears touching dirt. You couldn't pick that clean. You couldn't fix it that season. You just watched it happen, and you paid for it. Every acre. Every year it got worse. Now here's the part most men understood, or at least they used to. The beetle had one weakness. Just one. It needed corn. Not just any plant. Corn. The larvae hatch in the soil and go looking for corn roots. No corn, no food. No food, they die. Simple as that. So the old rule was simple too. Don't plant corn on the same ground twice in a row. You rotate. Corn one year, something else the next. Break the cycle. Starve the pest. It worked. It always worked. For a long time, nobody argued with that. It wasn't theory. It was just how things were done. Fathers taught it to sons. Not because they read it somewhere, but because they saw what happened when you didn't. But then the numbers changed. And when the numbers change, men start rethinking what they know. Around the late 90s and into the 2000s, corn stopped being just a crop. It became money. Real money. Ethanol demand kicked in. Prices went up. And not a little. You weren't talking about scraping by anymore. You were talking about margins that made a man think twice about every acre he wasn't planting corn on. If you had 1,000 acres and you planted corn on all of it, the math looked real good. Better than it ever had. If you rotated, you were leaving money on the table. Not a little. A lot. Enough that people started saying the old rules didn't make sense anymore. And that's when things started to shift. Not overnight, but fast enough. Year by year, more fields stayed corn. Then more. Then most. And once enough people were doing it, it didn't feel risky anymore. It felt normal. That's how it always goes. When enough men do the same thing, it stops feeling like a choice. It starts feeling like the only way. And there was something else backing them up. Technology. BT corn. Seed engineered to kill the larvae. That was the promise. You didn't need to rotate anymore. The seed would handle it. The bug wouldn't stand a chance. That's what they were told. And for a while it looked true. Field stayed up. Yield stayed high. Checks came in. Nobody missed oats. Nobody missed I. Nobody missed doing things the slow way. Except one man. His name was Glenn Rinkenberger. Lived outside Flanagan. Farm had been in his family longer than most men in the county had been alive. He didn't switch. Not when the prices went up. Not when his neighbors did. Not when the co-op started talking numbers that didn't make sense to ignore. He kept rotating. Corn, oats, soybeans. Same pattern. Year after year. It wasn't the easiest way to farm. It wasn't the most profitable, at least not on paper. And people noticed. You don't do something different in a place like that without people noticing. They talked about it. Not behind his back either. Right there at the elevator. Glenn's planting oats again. So like it was a joke, everyone already understood. And it was for a while. Because while they were planting corn on every acre and pulling in big numbers, Glenn was splitting his ground. A quarter here, a quarter there. Oats didn't pay like corn. He didn't pay like corn. It wasn't even close. So every spring, it looked like the same story. Everyone else moving forward. Glenn holding himself back. That's how it looked. And if you just looked at 1 year, maybe 2, that's exactly what it was. He was making less. No way around it. He knew the math. He wasn't confused. He just didn't believe the ending. Most men don't think that far out. Not when the money is right in front of them. Not when everything is working. And to be fair, it was working. The BTC did what it was supposed to do. The bugs didn't show up in numbers that mattered. Field stayed clean. Yield stayed high. Year after year. Enough years that people stopped even thinking about the old problem. That's another thing that happens. If something doesn't go wrong for long enough, men start to believe it can't. Or won't. Or at least not to them. Glenn heard all of it. The numbers. The arguments. The jokes. He didn't fight any of it. He didn't try to convince anyone. He didn't stand there explaining soil biology or pest cycles. That's not how those conversations go anyway. He just kept doing what he was doing, planting oats when nobody else did, keeping hay in the rotation when it didn't pay like corn, leaving money on the table, at least that's how it looked. And every year that corn prices stayed high, that gap got bigger. You could measure it. You could point to it. You could say, right there, that's what you're losing. And they did, over and over, enough that most men would have changed. Not because they were wrong, but because it's hard to be the only one standing still when everyone else is moving, especially when they're getting paid for it. Glenn didn't move. Not that year. Not the next one. Not the one after that. He wasn't waiting for something to happen. He already knew something would. That's the part nobody else really understood. To them, the system was working. To him, it just hadn't been tested yet. There's a difference, a big one, but you don't see it until later. And later always comes slower than you think. So for a long time, it looked like this. One man planting like it was 30 years ago. Everyone else planting like it was the future. And the future was paying. Good money. Enough that nobody was asking many questions. Not anymore. Not about rootworms. Not about rotation. Not about what happens when you do the same thing on the same ground year after year. Because nothing was happening. That was the proof. Or at least it felt like it. Fields looked fine. Checks cleared. Equipment got upgraded. More corn. Every year. The system wasn't just holding. It was winning. And Glenn was the outlier. The one who didn't get it. Or didn't want to. Depends who you asked. But here's the thing about systems that always work. They don't break slowly. They don't give you much warning. They hold. And they hold. And they hold. And then one year they don't. And when that year comes, it doesn't look like a small problem. It looks like something that's been building for a long time. Because it has. Most men just didn't see it building. Glenn did. He just never said much about it. He didn't have to. He was already making his decision every spring and paying for it every fall, while everyone else was making more. A lot more. That's what made it hard to ignore. That's what made it easy to laugh. Because when a man is losing money by choice, people assume he's wrong. That's a safe assumption. Most of the time, it's true, but not always. And that's the part nobody likes to think about. Because if it's not always true, then you have to ask a harder question. What if the thing that's making you money right now is the same thing that's going to cost you later? That question doesn't get asked when the checks are good. It gets asked when they're not. And by then, it's usually too late to change what you should have done years earlier. That's how it was shaping up in Livingston County. Nobody said it out loud. Not yet. Because nothing had gone wrong. Not in a way you couldn't explain away. Not in a way that made you rethink the whole system. But something was. There. Under the surface. In the soil. Year after year. Waiting. That's the part about pests. They don't rush. They don't need to. They just adapt. Quietly. One season at a time. And when they're ready, they don't ask for permission. They don't warn you. They just show up in numbers that don't make sense anymore. And by the time you notice, you're not dealing with a small problem. You're dealing with something that's already ahead of you. Most men in that county weren't thinking about any of that. They were thinking about next year's crop, next year's price, next year's check. That's normal. That's how you stay in business. Until it isn't enough. Glenn was thinking a few years past that. Not because he was smarter, because he'd seen what happens when things get pushed too far in one direction. He'd seen it before. Different crops. Same pattern. It works. Then it doesn't. Simple as that. He didn't know exactly when it would turn. Nobody does. But he knew it would. That's why he never changed. Even when it cost him. Especially when it cost him. Because if you only do something when it's easy, it's not really a system. It's just a reaction. And reactions don't hold up when things go bad. Systems do. Or they don't. But you don't find out which one you're running until something pushes it. Hard. For Livingston County, that push hadn't come yet. Not in a way anyone took seriously. But it was coming. And when it did, it wasn't going to ask who was ready. It was just going to show who was. And who wasn't. And at that point, the money wouldn't matter the same way. Because the question wouldn't be how much you made. It would be how much you kept. And how much you lost trying to keep it going. For now, though, everything still looked fine. Better than fine. Profitable. Predictable. Stable. That's when systems are the most dangerous. Not when they're failing. When they're working. Because that's when nobody looks for the crack. And there was one man in that county who never stopped looking. Not because he was worried. Because he didn't trust something that worked too well for too long. He'd seen that before. It always ends the same way, just not on your schedule, on its own. And when it ends, it doesn't negotiate. It doesn't ease in. It breaks. And when it breaks, you don't get your years back. You don't get to redo the decisions that felt right at the time. You just deal with what's left. Most of them weren't thinking about that. Not yet. They were still planting corn. Every acre, every year, and making money doing it. That was enough. Until it wasn't. And when that changed, it changed fast. But that part hadn't happened yet. Not in this part of the story. Right now, everything still worked. The system held. The money came in. And Glenn Rinkenberger was still the man planting oats. Still the one doing less of what paid. Still the one people pointed at when they talked about doing things the old way. He heard it. He knew what it looked like. He just didn't care. Because he wasn't farming for that year. Or for the next one. He was farming for what happens when things stop working. And in a place where everything was working, that made him the only man preparing for a problem nobody else believed in. Not yet. But belief doesn't change what's coming. It just changes how ready you are when it gets there. And in Livingston County, most men were about to find out the difference between something that works and something that lasts. For a long time, nothing went wrong. That's what made it so convincing. Year after year, the corn stayed up. The yields came in strong. The checks got bigger. Not just a little bigger. Enough that men started changing how they thought about land. Not as something you manage carefully. As something you push, because it looked like it could take it. And when something holds under pressure, people assume it always will. That's how the shift really happened. Not from ignorance, from confidence. They weren't guessing. They had proof. 5 years of it, then 8, then 10. Fields planted corn after corn after corn. Same ground, same crop, same result. It worked. And every year it worked, it made the old way look weaker, slower. Less profitable, harder to justify. Rotation started to feel like a luxury. Something you did when you couldn't do better. Not something you had to do. And that's when the pressure really showed up. Not from the land, from other men. You'd stand at the elevator in the spring, talking seed, talking price, talking acreage. And the numbers didn't lie. If you were planting corn on half your ground, you were making less. Everyone could see it. Nobody had to say it out loud. But they did anyway. You're leaving money out there. That was the line. Heard it enough times, it starts to sound like fact. And for most of them, it was because they weren't thinking about 10 years. They were thinking about this one, maybe the next. That's how you stay afloat. That's how you make payments. That's how you grow. Short-term matters. It always does. That's what made Glenn stand out. Not because he was louder. Because he wasn't. He didn't argue. He didn't try to win those conversations. He just stood there, listened, and kept doing what he'd been doing. Which made it worse. Because when a man argues, you can argue back. When he doesn't, you're left talking at him. And that gets uncomfortable. So it turned into something else. Jokes. Not mean. Not exactly. But steady. Every year, Glenn's planting oats again. Like it was a story everyone already knew the ending to. And in a way, they did. Because on paper, it made no sense. You had corn bringing in real money. Oats bringing in a fraction of that. Hay somewhere in the middle, but still not close. So every acre Glenn didn't put into corn looked like a mistake. A choice to earn less. And not just a little less. Enough to matter. Enough that most men wouldn't even consider it. And he did it every year. Same pattern. Same acres. Same result. Lower total income. There's no way to hide that. You could talk about soil. You can talk about long-term yield. But when the checks are written, numbers are numbers. And his were smaller. That's what people saw. That's what they judged. And to be fair, they weren't wrong. Not in that moment. That's the part that matters. They weren't stupid. They were making the right decision for the situation they were in. Or at least it looked that way. Because everything around them supported it. The market, the technology, the yields. All of it said the same thing. Plant more corn. So they did. And it worked. Which made it harder to question. You don't question something that's paying you. You defend it. You double down on it. You expand it. That's what happened. Fields that used to rotate stopped rotating. Then more. Then almost all of them. By the time it leveled out, most of the county was running continuous corn. Protected by BT traits. Backed by years of good results. That's not a risky position. That's a strong one. At least it looks that way. Glenn didn't move with it. Not even a little. He kept the 4-year rotation. Corn once every 4 years on the same ground. 3 years without it. Enough time to break anything that depended on it. That's what he was counting on. Not the price. Not the market. The break. Time is a tool. Most men weren't using time that way anymore. They were compressing it, getting as much out of each acre as they could, every year. And again, it worked. That's what made Glenn look like he was stuck. Like he didn't adapt. Like he missed something everyone else saw. You could hear it in how they talked about him. Not angry. Not even critical. Just certain. He's doing it the old way. That's all it takes. Once something gets labeled old, it doesn't matter if it works. It gets replaced. Especially when the new way pays more. Glenn knew that. He just didn't care. Because he wasn't comparing one year to the next. He was comparing systems. And systems don't show their weaknesses right away. They hide them. Especially when conditions are good. And conditions were good. Good enough that the gap between Glenn and everyone else got wider. You could measure it in acres. You could measure it in dollars. You could measure it in how people talked about success. And Glenn didn't fit that picture. Not anymore. Maybe he did once. But not now. Now success looked like continuous corn. Big acres. Big numbers. Efficient. Modern. Scalable. Glenn looked like something else. Smaller corn acreage. More variety. Lower totals. Harder to explain. Harder to defend. That's what made it interesting. Because he never tried to defend it. He didn't walk into those conversations with charts or arguments. He didn't try to prove anyone wrong. He just kept showing up every season and doing the same thing. That kind of consistency does something to people. At first, they laugh at it. Then they question it. Then they ignore it. Because it doesn't fit the story they're telling themselves. And the story they were telling was simple. This works. We're making money. There's no reason to change. That's a strong story. Hard to break. Especially when it's backed by results. For years, that story held. Nothing challenged it. Not in a way that mattered. There were small signs. There always are. But small signs don't change behavior. Not when the big picture still looks good. You need something bigger than that. Something that forces the question. That hadn't happened yet. So the gap kept growing. Glenn kept planning the same way. Everyone else kept pushing harder. More corn. More acres. More dependence on the same system. That's what people don't always see when something works. They don't just use it. They lean on it. More every year. Until it's not just a choice anymore. It's the whole structure. And once it becomes the structure, it's hard to step away from it. Even if you want to. Because everything else is built around it. Equipment. Inputs. Expectations. Debt. All of it assumes the system will keep working. That's the real risk. Not the decision itself. The dependence that follows. Glenn never built that kind of dependence. He couldn't. His system didn't allow it. It was slower. More balanced. Less aggressive. That's what kept him from scaling the same way. And what kept him from falling into the same trap. But at the time, nobody called it trap. They called it success. And they had the numbers to prove it. That's why this part of the story matters. Because this is where most people stop thinking. This is where they decide they've already won. Everything after this feels unnecessary. Why worry about something that hasn't happened? Why plan for something you haven't seen? That's a fair question. It's also the one that costs the most when the answer finally shows up. Glenn wasn't asking that question anymore. He'd already answered it for himself. Years earlier. That's why he didn't change when everything else did. Not because he didn't see the opportunity. Because he didn't trust it. Not completely. He trusted what he'd seen over time more than what he was seeing right now. That's a hard thing to do. Especially when it makes you look wrong in the moment. Especially when it costs you money. Real money. Every year. That's what most people can't sit through. Being wrong in public. For years. While everyone else is right. That's the pressure Glenn was under. Not from the land. From the results. From the numbers that said he should change. From the men who had already changed and were doing better because of it. That's what makes this part of the story uncomfortable. Because if you're honest, most people wouldn't have done what he did. Not for that long. Not with that kind of gap. They would have adjusted. Just a little at first. Then more. Then all the way. Because it makes sense. Until it doesn't. And that's the part nobody had seen yet. Not clearly. Not in a way that forced. Anything. It was still coming. Still building. Under the surface. In the soil. In the biology. In the repetition. Year after year. Same crop. Same field, same pressure. That's how resistance builds. Not fast, not loud, quiet, gradual, almost invisible, until it isn't. And when it shows up, it doesn't ask if you're ready. It just shows you what you've been building. That moment hadn't hit Livingston County yet. Not fully, but it was close. Closer than most of them thought. Because the longer something works, the less prepared you are when it stops. And it was about to stop. Not slowly, not in a way you could adjust to over time, but all at once, across fields that looked exactly the same the year before. That's the part nobody saw coming. Except one man. And even he didn't know when it would hit. Just that it would. So he kept doing what didn't pay as well. Year after year. While everyone else kept doing what did. And for a long time, that made him look like the only man in the county who didn't understand how the game had changed. The truth was, he understood it better than most. He just wasn't playing the same game. And that difference doesn't show up right away. It shows up later, when the rules you've been relying on stop working. And by then, the only thing that matters is what you built before that happened. Most of them were about to find out what they had built, and what they hadn't. For a while, the first signs didn't look like anything. That's how it usually starts. Not with a disaster. With something small enough to ignore. A field here. A patch there. Corn that didn't stand quite right. Yields a little lower than expected. Not enough to panic. Not enough to change anything. Just enough to explain away. Weather. That was the first answer. It's always the first answer. Too wet. Too dry. Wrong timing. You can blame weather for almost anything in farming. And most of the time, you're not even wrong. So that's what they did. They looked at a few weak fields and said it was a bad year in spots. Nothing more. The system still worked. That's what mattered. And for the most part, it did. You could drive past 10 good fields before you saw one that looked off. That's not a problem. That's normal. Every year has variation. Every year has a few disappointments. Nobody builds a new system because of a few weak spots. So they didn't. They planted again. Same as before. Corn on corn. Same seed traits. Same approach. Because nothing had failed. Not really. Not yet. But under the ground, something had already changed. Not overnight. Not all at once. But enough. The kind of change you don't see until it crosses a line. And once it crosses that line, it doesn't go back. That's the thing about resistance. It doesn't announce itself. It builds quietly. Every year you apply the same pressure, you select for the few that survive it. And the ones that survive don't stay rare. They multiply, slowly at first, then faster, until one year, there are enough of them that the old system doesn't work the way it used to. That's what was happening. Most of them didn't know it yet. They couldn't see it, because above ground, everything still looked close to normal. But below ground, the math had already changed. The larvae that should have died didn't. Not all of them. Just enough. Enough to carry it forward. Enough to come back stronger the next year. And the next. Glenn didn't need a report to know that. He didn't need confirmation from a university. He understood the pattern. Not the exact numbers. The pattern. Same crop. Same field. Same control method. Year after year. That doesn't stay stable. It can't. You don't have to know when it breaks. Just that it will. That's what he was betting on. Not a specific year. Not a specific outcome. Just the certainty that something pushed too far doesn't hold forever. The others weren't thinking that way. Why would they? They had 10 years of results that said the system worked. That's not theory. That's proof. And proof is hard to argue with, especially when it's making you money. That's what made this stage dangerous. Not because things were failing. Because they weren't failing enough. Not yet. They were still close enough to working that nobody felt urgency. Nobody felt pressure to change. That's the window where most mistakes lock in. Not when things are clearly broken. When they're almost working. Close enough to justify doing the same thing one more year. And then one more after that. That's what happened. Season after season. Small issues. Small losses. Nothing that forced a decision. So no decision was made. They stayed with what had been working. They had reasons. Good ones. The seed companies said the traits were still effective. The agronomists said manage it, monitor it, but nothing drastic. The numbers, overall, still look strong. That's enough. It's always enough until it isn't. Glenn didn't adjust. He didn't need to. His system wasn't under the same pressure. That's what rotation does. It doesn't just solve a problem. It prevents it from building. It removes the target. No corn. No food. No survival. No adaptation. You can't build resistance to something that isn't there. That's the part most of them had stepped away from. Not because they didn't understand it. Because they believed they had replaced it. Technology had replaced time. That was the trade. Faster returns, higher output, less waiting. It worked. For a while. That's the part nobody argues with. It did work. That's why so many trusted it. That's why they built around it. That's why they didn't see the risk. Because the risk didn't show itself early. It waited. And the longer it waited, the more confident everyone became. That's how it traps you. Not by failing early. By succeeding long enough that you stop questioning it. By the time the questions come back, they don't help much. Because the conditions that created the problem are already in place. That's where Livingston County was heading. Not there yet, but close. You could feel in the conversations, even if nobody said it directly. Questions started showing up. Quiet ones. You seeing anything strange in that south field? Yield seemed a little off in that block. Nothing definitive. Nothing you could act on. Just enough to notice. Not enough to change. And every time someone brought it up, someone else had an explanation. They always do. Because as long as there's an explanation, there's no reason to change behavior. That's how systems stretch past the point where they should have been adjusted. Glenn heard those conversations. Same as everyone else. He didn't join in. He didn't point out what it might mean. He didn't say, "This is it," because he didn't know that. He just knew what it looked like when things started to turn. Not sharply, gradually, quietly, until the pattern becomes clear. And by the time it's clear, it's already moved too far to fix quickly. That's what was coming. Not a bad field. Not a rough year. A shift. Across fields. Across farms. Across the whole system that had been built on the idea that it would keep working. That's what most men weren't prepared for. Not because they were careless. Because they were successful. Success makes you less sensitive to small warnings. It makes you trust the trend more than the signal. And the trend had been good for a long time. Long enough that it felt permanent. Glenn never treated it that way. He treated it like something temporary, even when it was paying others more than it was paying him. That's a hard position to hold, especially when the difference shows up every year in your income. But he held it, not because he enjoyed being right later, because he didn't trust what he was seeing now. That's a different mindset. Most people trust results. He trusted patterns. Patterns don't lie. They just take longer to show you what they mean. And by the time most people see it, they're already in it. That's where the county was. In it. Not fully exposed yet, but committed. That's the word. Committed to a system that depended on something continuing to work the same way it always had. That's the risk. Not using a system. Depending on it. Glenn wasn't depending on any single thing. That's why he didn't need to react. The others did. They just didn't know it yet. That's the stage where everything still looks manageable. Where you still believe you can adjust if you have to. Where you think you'll see the problem early enough to respond. That belief holds right up until the moment it doesn't. And when it breaks, it doesn't give you the time you thought you had. That moment was close now. Closer than most of them realized. Because the signs were no longer isolated. They were spreading. Still uneven. Still explainable. But more common. More consistent. Enough that you couldn't ignore them forever. But still early enough that most men would. That's what makes the shift so sharp when it finally shows itself. It's not new. It's just visible now. And when it becomes visible, it doesn't stay small. It expands fast. Because everything that allowed it to build is still in place. Same crop. Same fields. Same pressure. Nothing changes. Until something forces it to. That force was coming. Not as a theory. Not as a warning. As a result. A season where the explanation wouldn't hold. Where the numbers wouldn't line up with what people expected anymore. Where you couldn't call it weather. Or timing. Or bad luck. Just a system that stopped doing what it had been doing for years. That's the year that changes everything. And it was already on its way. Glenn didn't need to predict the exact season. He just needed to be in a position where it didn't matter when it happened. That's what his rotation gave him. Not higher income in the good years. Stability when the system broke. Most of them had chosen the opposite. Higher returns while things worked. Exposure when they didn't. That trade doesn't look dangerous at first. It looks smart, efficient, profitable, right up until the moment it turns. And when it turns, it doesn't give you partial losses. It hits the core of what you've been relying on. That's what was about to happen. Not slowly, not in a way that gave everyone time to adjust together, but fast enough that the difference between one system and another would show up in a single season. That's when the conversation changes. That's when the jokes stop. That's when people start asking different questions. Not about how much they made, about why it stopped working, and what they should have done before it did. That moment was close now. You could feel it, even if most of them didn't say it. The signs were there. The pattern was there. The pressure had been building long enough. It was ready to break. And when it did, it wouldn't be subtle. It would be obvious. Across fields, across farms, across the county. The same way the success had been. Wide, consistent, hard to ignore. That's the kind of failure that forces change. Not a suggestion, a requirement. Glenn was already there, already operating in a system that didn't depend on that one thing continuing to work. The others were about to find out what it felt like when it didn't. And when that happened, the difference between what works and what lasts would show up all at once. It didn't happen all at once. It just felt that way after. Early in the season, nothing looked wrong. That's how it always is. You plant. You watch it come up. Stands look decent. Not perfect, but good enough. Same as most years. No reason to think anything had changed. If anything, it looked like another normal season. That's what made it hit harder later. Because there was no clear moment where anyone said, "This is the year." It crept in, and it showed itself all at once. It started with fields that didn't hold. You drive by and see patches leaning. Not flat. Not yet. Just off. Enough that you noticed if you knew what you were looking at. Most didn't, or they didn't want to. Leaning corn can mean a lot of things. Wind, zen, compaction. It doesn't immediately point to something deeper. Not unless you've seen it before. Not unless you know what it looks like when roots aren't doing their job. That's what this was. Roots that weren't there anymore. Or not enough of them. Eaten down to almost nothing. So the plant stands until it doesn't. And when it starts to go, it doesn't come back. It gets worse. Day by day. More fields. More patches. Then whole rows. Then entire blocks. You didn't need a report anymore. You could see it from the road. That's when the explanations stopped working. You can't call that weather. Not when it's happening across different soils, different farms, different management. Not when it follows the same pattern everywhere. Leaning, falling, ears low. Harvest becomes a problem before you even get there. Because you know what's coming. A combine can't pick up corn that's laying down. Not clean, not efficiently. You lose it, right there in the field, before you even start. That's when the numbers change. Not in theory. In reality. You don't need a calculation. You see in what you can't harvest. That's the first loss. Then comes the yield itself. Because a plant without roots doesn't just fall. It stops feeding. Water. Nutrients. Everything gets cut off. So even the plants still standing aren't performing the way they should. You lose for both sides. What falls? And what survives poorly? That's when it stopped being a small problem. That's when it hit the whole system. Fields that had been corn for years started showing the same thing. Over and over. It didn't matter whose field it was. Didn't matter how clean it looked in June. By late season, you could tell. And once enough fields look like that, it's not a question anymore. It's a pattern. The kind you can't ignore. The kind you can't fix mid-season. That's when the conversation changed. Not at the elevator first. In the fields. Quietly. Men walking rows. Pulling plants. Looking at roots that weren't there. Or barely there. You don't need a degree to understand what that means. You just need to see it once. And then you see it everywhere. That's when the words started showing up. Resistance. Not as a theory. As an explanation. The seed that was supposed to handle it wasn't. Not anymore. Or not enough. Enough larvae were surviving that it didn't matter what the label said. The result was in the ground. And the result was bad. Worse than anything they'd dealt with in years. Because this wasn't a new pest. It was the same one. Just not behaving the way it used to. That's what caught them. Not something unexpected. Something they thought they had under control. That's always harder. Because you don't plan for it. You build around it. And when it changes, everything built on it shifts with it. That's what this was. A shift. Across acres. Across operations. Across a county that had leaned into one way of doing things for a long time. And now that way wasn't holding. Not everywhere. Not evenly. But enough. Enough that it hit the numbers. And once it hits the numbers, it's real. Yields dropped. Not a little. Enough to matter. Enough to show up in every conversation. Enough that you couldn't make it back with price or efficiency. You lost bushels. That's direct. That's measurable. And then there were the added costs. Because once you see a problem like that, you don't sit still. You react. Insecticides, soil treatments, extra passes, more money going in, trying to protect what's already been damaged, paying to fix something that wasn't supposed to break. That's a different kind of pressure, because now the system isn't just underperforming. It's costing more to maintain. That's when margins collapse. Not from one thing, from everything stacking at once. Lower yield, higher cost, same dependence on the system that caused it. That's a hard place to be, because you can't pivot quickly. Not when your whole operation is built around one crop, one cycle, one expectation. You can't just change mid-season. You ride it out, and you take the hit. That's what most of them did. There wasn't another option. Not that year. Not that late. So they watched it happen. Field after field. Farm after farm. Same story. Different acres. That's when it spread beyond the fields. Back to the elevator. Back to the conversations. But now the tone was different. Quieter. No jokes. No easy answers. Just questions. Real ones. You seeing this too? How bad is it on your side? Nobody was laughing about oats anymore. Nobody was talking about how much corn they planted. That stopped mattering. Because the problem didn't care how much you had. It just showed up where the conditions were right. And the conditions have been right for a long time. That's why it hit so wide. That's why it felt sudden. Even though it wasn't. It had been building for years. Now it was visible. That's the only difference. Glenn's fields didn't look like that. That's what stood out. Not because they were perfect, because they were normal. Standing. Stable. Roots doing what they were supposed to do. No pachis collapsing. No rows leaning over. Just corn. The way it's supposed to look late in the season. That contrast didn't need to be explained. You could see it driving past. Same county. Same weather. Different result. That's when people started paying attention. Not to what he said. To what they saw. Because at that point, words don't matter. Results do. And his were holding, while others weren't. That's the kind of difference you can't argue with. Not when you're looking at your own fields, doing something else. That's when the questions shifted. Not about whether rotation made less money. About why his fields weren't failing. That's a different conversation. And it didn't happen all at once either. It built the same way the problem did. Quietly. Field by field. Farm by farm. Men comparing what they had to what he had. Not publicly. Not at first. Just noticing. That's how change starts. Not from meeting. From observation. From seeing something work when yours doesn't. That's what happened that year. The year it broke. Not completely. Not everywhere. But enough. Enough that the system they had trusted didn't feel the same anymore. It still produced. It still functioned. But it wasn't reliable. And reliability is what everything else depends on. Once it's gone, everything else shifts. That's what they were dealing with now. Not a theory. Not a warning. A result. And once you've seen it, you don't forget it. Because you know it can happen again. That's what changes behavior. Not advice. Experience. And they had it now. Glenn had been operating with that understanding the whole time. That's why nothing changed for him that year. Same rotation. Same outcome. No added cost to fight something that didn't show up. No yield loss from roots that weren't there. Just a system doing what it had always done. That's what made the difference so clear. Not that he made more. That he didn't lose. In a year when loss was everywhere else. That's a different kind of advantage. Not exciting. Not fast. But real. And visible when it matters. That's what that season showed. Not that one way was perfect. That one way held when the other didn't. And once you see that, you don't go back to thinking the same way. You can't. Because now you know what happens when it stops working. And how fast it can change. That's what hit Livingston County that year. Not just a pest problem. A shift in how they understood the system they were running. It wasn't as stable as they thought. It wasn't as controllable as they believed. It worked. Until it didn't. And when it didn't give them time to adjust. It just showed them what they had built. And what they hadn't. And for the first time in a long time, Glenn Rinkenberger wasn't the man doing something old. He was the man not dealing with a problem everyone else was trying to figure out in real time. That changes how people look at things. Not overnight. But enough. Enough that the next season wouldn't look the same. Enough that the decisions made that winter would be different from the ones made the year before. Because now they had something they didn't have before. Proof. Not that rotation was right in theory, that it held when the other system didn't. And that kind of proof doesn't get ignored. Not after a year like that. Not after watching fields go down when they weren't supposed to. Not after paying for something that was supposed to prevent exactly that. That's the kind of year that resets things. Not gently, clearly. And once it's clear, the next question isn't whether something works. It's how long it will, and what you're building around that answer. That's where they were now, standing in fields that didn't match what they expected, looking at a system that didn't perform the way it had, and realizing, maybe for the first time, that what pays the most when everything works isn't always what holds when it doesn't. The next spring didn't sound the same. You could hear it before you saw it. At the elevator, at the seed counter, same place, same men, different tone. Nobody was talking about how many acres of corn they were putting in. Not first. The question had changed. Quiet, but clear. What are you planting after it? That wasn't a common question a year before. Now it was everywhere. Orders shifted. Not all at once. Not everyone, but enough to notice. Soybeans started coming back into rotations where they hadn't been in years. Some went half and half. Some didn't go that far, but they broke the pattern. A few asked about oats. That got attention. Not laughter. Attention. That's how you know something changed. When the thing people used to joke about becomes something they're willing to try. Nobody stood up and said they were wrong. That's not how it works. They didn't need to. The fields had already said it. You don't argue with a season like that. You adjust. Quietly. Practically. One decision at a time. That's what winter is for. Looking back at what happened. Deciding what not to repeat. Glenn didn't change anything. Same acres. Same rotation. Same approach. He didn't need to react because he never built around something that could fail that way. That's the difference. Not smarter. Positioned differently. While others were figuring out how to fix a problem, he was already outside of it. That doesn't happen by accident. It comes from what you decide before anything goes wrong. That's the part most people don't see when they look a year like that. They see the result. They don't see the years that made it possible. Glenn wasn't trying to win that season. He had been building toward not losing it. That's a different goal, and it shows up differently. You don't notice it when things are good. You notice it when they're not. That's when systems separate, not by how much they produce, by how much they hold. That winter, men drove out to his place. Not in groups, one at a time. You don't make a show of that. You ask a few questions, you listen. You look at what he's doing. You try to understand what you missed. Not everything he said mattered. What mattered was that it worked. And it had worked through something that broke everything else. That's enough to get attention. Not admiration. Not yet. Respect takes longer. But attention is where it starts. He didn't turn it into anything bigger than it was. No speeches. No, I told you so. That's not how those conversations go. He talked about the rotation. About breaking cycles. About not giving a problem a chance to build. Simple. Direct. Nothing new. That's what made it harder to ignore. Because it wasn't new. It was what they had already known. What they had moved away from. Not because it stopped working. Because something else paid more. For a while. That's the part that stays with you. Not that they didn't know. That they chose differently. And it made sense at the time. That's what makes it real. Nobody made a mistake on purpose. They made the best decision they could with the information they had. And it worked. Until it didn't. That's the pattern. Not just here. Everywhere. Any system pushed the same way, year after year, will respond. Maybe not immediately, but eventually. The timeline changes. The outcome doesn't. Glenn didn't talk about it like a lesson. He talked about it like something you accept. You don't beat it. You work with it. Or you deal with it later. That's the choice. Not between old and new. Between short and long. Between what pays now and what holds later. Most of them had leaned toward what paid now. That's not wrong. It's just incomplete. Because sooner or later shows up. And when it does, it asks what you built before it got there. That's what that year revealed. Not just a problem. A gap. Between systems that depended on one thing working and systems that didn't. That's the real difference. Not yield. Not price. Dependence. The more you depend on one outcome, the more exposed you are when it changes. Glenn's rotation spread that out. Not perfectly. Nothing is perfect, but enough. Enough that when one part got stressed, the whole system didn't collapse with it. That's stability. It doesn't look impressive in good years. It looks obvious in bad ones. That's when people start to understand it. Not from a chart, from experience. That's what Livingston County had now. Experience. Not a theory about what could happen. A memory of what did. That changes decisions. Not all at once. Not permanently for everyone. But enough. Enough that the pattern broke. Continuous corn didn't disappear. It just stopped being the default. Rotation came back. Not the same for everyone. Not 4 years. Mostly 2. Corn and soybeans. Enough to break the cycle. Enough to reduce the pressure. Not enough to build everything Glenn had built, but enough to change the outcome. That's how it usually happens. People don't go all the way back. They adjust just enough to avoid what hurt them last time. That's practical. That's real. Over time, some will go further. Some won't. That's fine. The point isn't perfection. It's awareness. Knowing what happens when you push something too far. Knowing what it costs to ignore that. Glenn's place didn't change much. Same drill. Same pattern. Same approach. New equipment where it made sense. Technology where it helped. But nothing that replaced the core. That's the part that mattered. The foundation didn't depend on any single tool continuing to work. That's why it held. Tools change. Traits fail. Prices move. Those things don't stay still. If your system depends on them staying the same, it's only a matter of time. Glenn's didn't. That's what made it last. Not because it was old, because it didn't rely on something that could be pushed past its limit. That's what most of them saw after that year. Not in words, in outcomes. You could stand at the edge of a field and see the difference. You could look at what held and what didn't. That's enough. You don't need more explanation than that. That's how most of the lessons in farming get learned. Not for someone telling you, from something showing you. That's what that season did. It showed them. Not gently, not gradually, clearly. And once you've seen it that way, you don't forget it, even when things go back to normal. Especially then, because now you know what normal can turn into. That changes how you look at a good year. Not as proof that everything works. As a window where everything hasn't been tested yet. That's a different way to think. Slower, less certain, but more accurate. Glenn had been thinking that way the whole time. That's why he didn't need that year to change anything. It just confirmed what he already believed. For everyone else, it was the first time they had to face it directly. That's what makes it stick. Not advice, not history, experience. Once you pay for something like that, you don't need to be convinced. You adjust. Not because someone told you to, because you don't want to go through it again. That's what brought rotation back. Not tradition, not theory. Consequence. That's always the strongest driver, and it always comes eventually. The only question is when, and what it costs when it gets there. That's what this story comes down to. Not a man who was right. A system that held, and a system that didn't. Both made sense at the time. Both worked for a while. Only one kept working when it mattered. That's the difference. Not between smart and wrong. Between what works and what lasts. You can build around something that pays. Or you can build around something that holds. Sometimes you can have both. For a while. But if you have to choose, the choice shows up later. Not in the years when everything is easy. In the year when it isn't. That's when you find out what you've been building. And by then, you don't get to change the past. You just live with it. Glenn never had to make that adjustment. Because he made his choice before it was forced on him. That's what set him apart. Not the crops. Not the rotation. The timing of the decision. Early. Before the pressure. Before the proof. Before it paid to do it. That's the hardest time to make a decision like that. And the only time it really counts. Because once the proof shows up, everyone can see it. The difference is who acted before they had to. And who waited until they didn't have a choice. That's the part that stays with you. Not the yield numbers. Not the prices. The timing. Because timing decides whether you adjust by choice or by consequence. And those two feel very different when you're the one living through them.